100 Days of Halloween is happening right now, and I have two books that you need to add to your TBR. Hello, everyone. I'm author RL Raintree. This is Reels and Reads, where I give honest reviews and occasional spoilers. Before I hop into my review of Never Whistle at Night versus the second edition, Never Whistle at Night Back for Blood, go ahead and click that like, subscribe, and turn on that notification bell button so that you can get more reviews like this one. I don't just do book reviews, I do film reviews. So if there's a book you want me to review, if you're an author who wants me to review your novel, please feel free to head into my bio, give me a contact, and I will give your book a review and post the review here online. Unless, of course, it didn't do so well and you don't want me to tell anybody. I would understand. So let's do a little housekeeping before we get started. Yes, I am wearing my Rocky Horror Picture Show shirt because I am recording like 10 videos in one day. I haven't done a video in like 2 weeks. I need to catch up. So forgive me for looking like a cartoon character. And yes, we are back to sitting on my bed. I've got my white sheets and my really boring headboard and all of my little knickknacks up top. Accept me for who I am. This is who I am. I don't have a single wall in this house that's as interesting as all the other booktubers and movie tubers that would fit the aesthetic. So some of us are just not aesthetically pleasing. I apologize. First up, we have Never Whistle at Night. I have a hard copy of this one. I will probably put an image of the book beside me so you can see it without it being reversed. I want to show you the flags, which may be difficult to see because of the color. Maybe if I turn it this way, you can see that the flags stop right about here, which is essentially about halfway through the book. And if you're an annotator, that should tell you something about what I think of the book. I also want to show you that at the top, there are only 4 flags at the top because there are 4 stories that I wanted to highlight. So what this is, for people who are not aware, this book has actually been out for a couple of years, and it is essentially a horror anthology. And the term Never Whistle at Night is something that we say in the Indigenous community. In fact, Black people have it in our community as well. There's a lot of people who have this belief that you don't whistle at night because it'll call the spirits to you, and they're not necessarily in the best of moods. So that's a great title for this book. So this book is readily available everywhere. You could probably find it at a used bookstore by now. However, the sequel, Back for Blood, is not going to be available until August 18th. It is definitely worth going to get it right away on day one, but I'm going to compare the two for you so you can decide if it's in your budget, if you can only buy one, which one you should buy. So first I want to show you the first flag of the first book, and that is White Hills. This one wasn't necessarily terrifying in a way that I would classify as horror, but it is definitely horror. This is a story, and I'm not going to give you any spoilers for any of the stories in any of these books, but this is a story that is greatly focused on identity. In the Indigenous world, we have colorism issues where sometimes it's the women, sometimes it's the men. They want to marry white, despite that ethnicity being their biggest oppressor, and somehow marrying white, passing for white, can be a positive thing from the point of view of certain people. I think we have that in all ethnicities of color. Black people know people who are like that as well. Hispanic people know people who are like that as well. So this story is about a woman who does that. She has completely concealed her indigenous heritage because she's mixed race. And that in and of itself becomes a horror story when she goes to tell her white husband that she's pregnant. I honestly can't tell you anything more about that, but just know it has a lot to do with her identity. So it is somewhat of a, well, not somewhat, definitely a racial horror, but it goes far beyond that. And I think that that Black readers are definitely going to understand that story more than most. They're also going to be super creeped out by that one. Another story that I bookmarked was Snakes Are Born at Night. Listen, this one had so much going on. This one, it was a story about an indigenous man and his cousin who is part white. In fact, that's a running theme. I'll circle back to it. He has a cousin who's part white who is dating a white guy, and he takes them to a sacred place, or at least a historically precious place, and there are rock carvings, rock paintings, and he goes to show it to them and explain the significance of it in their culture. Needless to say, the white boyfriend is not very respectful at all, and the mostly white cousin is not really standing her ground the way she should. She's basically being a pick me for her white boyfriend over her own culture, over the sacredness of this particular location. And a whole bunch of supernatural things begin to happen, grotesque supernatural things begin to happen. So make sure that you have not eaten before you read the story. This is definitely one of my favorite ones because there are consequences for people who disrespect their own culture and others who disrespect other people's culture. It's not the same as what happens in the previous story, but it is definitely a more twisted consequence for similar circumstances. Another story that I tabbed was Heart Shaped Clock. Now, this one isn't so much a horror story in the traditional sense. It's up for interpretation when I say horror. This one is a story about a young boy who has a brother, and their parents got a divorce. You know, it didn't work out. But for reasons I'll never understand in the real world, the parents decided to split the boys. One parent takes one boy, the other parent takes the other boy. I know that this happens in real life, and I'll never understand this. Needless to say, one child always thinks the other child has it better. It's up to the reader to determine who they think had it better. And so, of course, there comes a time when these two have to come back together, and then that's when we have a lot of tension. One had one path in life, one had the other path in life, and it causes stereotypes and certain biases for and against one brother versus the other, and it ends in tragedy. And that in and of itself is a horror when we consider the tragedy that takes place. But it's not just the tragedy that takes place, it's the aftermath, because it starts at the end and then works backwards to tell us how we got to that point. This story actually made me feel a little sad, made me think quite a bit, but it is definitely an excellent story. Another story I tabbed is called Sundays. Now, Sundays, I tagged this one not because it was my favorite or anything like that. I tagged it because despite the fact that I don't believe in trigger warnings, you guys are going to need a trigger warning for this if you do believe in them. This one is a story of sexual abuse by priests against Indigenous American children at a boarding school. It doesn't give graphic detail, but it does give emotionally graphic detail that take place during the act. So instead of describing the act, it's describing what it's like to be the child experiencing the non-consensual act. So I really want to give you a heads up on that. If you're able to get through that, this is such an important story to read. I was very disappointed in how it ended, but I can't tell you why, otherwise it'll spoil it for you. But I will say that I'm a very vengeful person, and I needed blood and carnage and violence. Though there was violence, I just needed more because of my own personal experiences with Indigenous people in boarding schools and what priests did to them. So I tagged that one to give you guys a trigger warning. And I forgot to mention the author of Sundays is David Weska Wanbli Whedon. I hope I pronounced that correctly. I did a review of his most recent novel, Wisdom Corner. So if you were a fan of Wisdom Corner or his previous novel, you may definitely be a fan of Sundays. But again, trigger warning. Now, I want to talk about the stories that I didn't bookmark. Those were actually my favorites. So the ones that I did tell you that I bookmarked were, in fact, my favorite ones as well, with the exception of Sundays, because that one was just too realistic for me. But the ones I liked the most, I actually forgot to tag, and that is Kushtuka. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right. Now, this one is full-on paranormal story. It's more based on folklore, which is my kind of horror story, because it's impossible to terrify me. So I love the historical horror, the folklore, the legends and things that were passed down from generations. Now, this takes place, I believe it's an Inuit tribe. I could be wrong, but it's in the cold parts of Alaska, obviously. And there is a woman who goes to a white man's house to do some work. And when she's there, she finds artifacts that were specifically made by her people. And I don't just mean by her tribe. I mean by her family members in her tribe, her grandmother, her great-great-grandmother. And these people have it decorating their house like a museum. So when the man tells her to basically go in the kitchen and cook, she sees the wooden spoon, she sees, the particular I don't know what the words are. They use their indigenous terms for it, but she sees cookware that is meant to be cooked with, and it was her own grandmother. She knows what to do with it, and so she goes to cook with it, and the white man tells her, "No, no, no, that's that's valuable. That's sacred. You can't do that. We have modern day appliances." And so then when she says, essentially, when I told you that that's sacred to me and my people, and that means a lot to us, you say, "Oh, it's just, a little collectible thing. It's no big deal." But when I go to use it the way my people used it, all of a sudden it's irreplaceable. So clearly these white people know how valuable and how important these artifacts are that they have using decorating their houses. But when an indigenous person actually goes to use the artifact the way it was intended to be used, suddenly, no, 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 you can't use it or you'll damage it. So then you know how important it is. You just want to keep it for yourself instead of give it back to us. Now, there is a creature. I don't want to say anything about it because I don't want to ruin it for anyone. But when I tell you that if you have a problem with doppelgangers, whatever, mimics. You have a problem with that one, you probably shouldn't read this one at night. I love how ambiguous the story is because I'm not quite sure if this was a good thing, if this was a bad thing, if this creature actually existed. There's a lot of ambiguity there up for interpretation, but it is bloody. It is culturally relevant. It's just such a good story. I can't say enough about it. And I'm stuck between whether that one is my favorite story or a completely different one is my favorite story. And that one is called Navajos Don't Wear Elk Teeth. That one is more of a murder mystery, more of a thriller, more of a suspense, but it's still horrific when you find out what's really going on. I refer you back to the title. Now, this one is an LGBTQ story. It's not the only one, and it does get graphic in the sexual area. Those of you who don't like smut in your horror, those of you who don't like that sort of thing, you may get a little turned off as far as the sexual component because it is very graphic. I don't mean the LGBTQ part. I just mean it's very graphic down to lubrication, put it that way. So if you're not into graphic sexual scenes, then that may be a story that you want to skip. But I actually liked how graphic it was, not because of, it's spicy or anything like that, but with it being so blunt, so graphic, the language that was used, because it's being told from the internal dialogue of one of the characters, I liked it so much. It's so incredibly raw and gritty that I thoroughly enjoyed that story. But at the same time, so was the other story. It was also very raw and very gritty, and it had the folklore paranormal aspect to it. So I honestly couldn't tell you which one of those I liked more. What I will tell you again is that if you need a trigger warning, it's kind of borderline sexual assault as far as I'm concerned. I would consider this as sexual assault. And I have to kind of give details so you can decide if you want to read this. There is a moment when one of the characters comes up behind the other characters and kind of initiates the act. Now, the person receiving the act isn't upset about it. They're fine with it, but it is described as very aggressive and loveless. And painful in a way, but it's not described as if the person doesn't like it or is non-consenting to it. It's a gray area. And then prior to that, there is an oral scene where it is consensual, but oh gosh, how do I word this? Again, aggressive. Someone is being pushed to their limit, not necessarily given consent to be pushed to that limit, but the person also isn't saying no, or it's very difficult for me to describe. So I guess I should say it's dubious consent. There we are. There's dubious consent happening in this story, and it is an LGBTQ story. So if you're a person who is of that community and experienced this type of situation, it may be triggering for you. But again, even with that being involved in it, that story plus the one I just told you about, I honestly couldn't tell you which one of those is the best story. There were so many stories that I loved in here. I ran out of tags. I ran out of flags. However, I will call your attention to the fact that the second half of the book, I didn't have any flags really to put in there. The pace of the book at that point slowed down tremendously for me. I think that other people are going to enjoy it quite well, but it became more preachy towards the end. It became less about horror and more about preserving culture, more about, a lesson being taught to the character. It lost that grittiness. It lost the supernatural aspect. It lost the terror. It lost the surprise factor for me once we got to the second half of the book. I found myself speed reading to get through the ending. Now, I know what you're thinking. I've been going for a very long time when it comes to the first book. How long am I going to go for the second book? Well, that's a bit of the problem. See, in the second book, there were only two stories that I liked, and there were what I think there were 20, 21, possibly 24 stories in the second book. Anyone who's read the second book will tell you that Miss Cherokee Princess 1996 is the best story in the book. Every review I've seen has mentioned this story. Now, there are other stories that people will mention. A second story that I enjoyed was Uncivilized, but Miss Cherokee Princess 1996, if you get this book, if you read that story, I need you guys to come right back here and tell me what you think happened. It was ambiguous in the ending. It can be interpreted one way or the other. It's not a cliffhanger. It's not a, hey, what just happened? It's really going to come down to how you interpret the ending. It is grotesque. It is disturbing. It is psychological. And it does carry that theme of ethnic identity for a mixed race Indigenous woman. Only this person wants to appear more Indigenous than she actually is. I'm telling you, this one is very disturbing, and clearly it involves the plot of a pageant. And keeping up with the theme of crime thriller, yet still horrific, much like Navajos Don't Wear Elk Teeth, we have a story